Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 55th episode of the Truth Island podcast. Fifth episode of the Truth Island podcast. When we think of the right education, many of us no longer think of the word privilege, but rather education as being a basic human right. Long gone are the days which rich nobles and kings would hire private tutors to teach the future heirs to the throne philosophy, religion, and just enough science to rule over the realm, while the masses toil away in the fields. The birth of the industrial economy and now the information age has created a global need for highly skilled and literate workers that can learn on their own, develop unique thoughts, engage in critical thinking, and at an even more basic level, read and write. As the days of the illiterate peasant, through the sheer strength of his muscles overcoming the hardships of poverty, are beginning to become increasingly rare, the right to a good education has become just as important as access to clean drinking water. Yet somehow, in the United States, the basic right is not afforded to everyone. Some of us get to attend well funded and disciplined public and private schools that stress rigor, accountability, teach critical thinking at a high level, and instill the belief in their students that they too can become future rulers of this great nation. However, for a growing number of us living in the States, an educational feudalism has started to take root with the emergence of overcrowded schools, where lawlessness and unruly behavior is the norm, content that is presented as simply a means to an end with regards to standardized testing, and little to no critical thinking being generated. In fact, it is not at all uncommon for many of America's high school graduates in some of our most impoverished communities to graduate high school and only be able to read at no higher than a third grade reading level, despite holding a diploma that suggests otherwise. As the inequality chasm rises in the country, the need to extract complex pieces of information from written text is going to become of ever increasing importance, as there is only so much we can learn from YouTube videos and what other people tell us to do. Many educational experts in the US claim that they have tried everything and retire on "it is what it is" type of mentality, and that if we are simply more softer and permissive with our most disadvantaged students, the problem will eventually correct itself. But perhaps hope and answers simply lie north of the border to our brothers and sisters up in Canada. I am once again joined by Daniel, who was both a student and teacher in Canada, comes to the show to not only remind us that Canada can teach us a thing or two about healthcare, but education as well. Daniel, thanks so much for being on the show. I'm hoping this episode reaches enough people down here in the States before the last of our critical thinking is completely gone.
Well, thank you for having me, Aaron. That's quite an ominous way to get ourselves into things here. I guess it's a little indicative of how you're feeling generally, both as a student and a teacher, about what happened down there.
Daniel, please shine a ray of light on us because down here below you guys, we really need to see some light.
So, I think I should maybe remind the listeners that Canada is a very, very large country and it spans, from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. And just like there are lots of similarities between the different sections of the United States, the same is very much true in Canada, albeit much, much smaller proportionally in terms of population. We have a West Coast culture, we have an East Coast culture, we have a central Canada prairies kind of culture, and we have the French culture with our neighbors in Quebec. And then in Ontario, there's lots of different sections within Ontario too. I am based in the Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. So when I'm speaking, I want everyone to be mindful of the fact that I'm actually talking about a very narrow slice of Canadian education and Canadian life and upbringing. So that's kind of my first big disclaimer that I am, we are going to be making some pretty big claims about education and the state of it and how we approach it here with air quotes in Canada. But bear in mind that within each province, it's very different from each other because education is a provincial mandate, not a federal mandate. And then also within each area, there's different boards or districts, I think might be a more familiar term. So what the Toronto District School Board does, it could be very, very different than what the Hamilton District School Board does. And they're, an hour and a half drives away from each other, or 2 hours. So bearing all that in mind,
And the same
yes.
thing, and the same
Mhm.
thing with the US. When I speak about my experiences, I'll be speaking from like a New York City perspective. And
Mhm.
for all I know, things are done radically different in Connecticut, or I
Yes.
mean, from what I've heard, things are done pretty similarly in major cities, but you're right. Even
Mhm.
in the States, we are only speaking about a certain jurisdiction.
Yeah. But I think for our purposes, it's pretty interesting to go with New York City and Toronto. I think if we're going to go with an analog, I think that's a pretty good, comparison to make, because we have one of the biggest, if not the biggest city in the States, with one of the biggest, if not the biggest city in Canada. So it kind of works, but I do want that to kind of be clear, because even though I'm talking about Toronto, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto, just kind of west of there. And so the school system there is going to be different than in the downtown core, right? But I guess I've been invited to talk about my experience as a student, and then my experience maybe as a teacher too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I'll start with my elementary years. I actually started in a Montessori school. I'm not sure if you or your listeners are familiar with the idea of Montessori, but it's basically play-based, child-centered education,
Hmm.
where social activities and tasks where you're having fun and you're playing, but you're still stimulated and challenged. That's kind of what the idea of Montessori was, very much play-based learning. So I did that for about 2 years.
Is
Um,
there just a question, is there
mhm.
like a curriculum with that, or like are there certain like general concepts? Like obviously the teachers, even though you're playing, the teachers still have to
Mhm.
kind of make sure that you can read at a proficient level, right?
Yeah, so I can give you an example of an activity that I remember very clearly. I don't know if fondly, but we have these little wooden boards that have activities on them. Activity is kind of the hot word in Montessori. And it was a shoelace that was tied to look like a shoe, but it's on a board that you can kind of hold in front of you. So you can practice tying a shoelace over and over again. And we would have a bunch of those boards, a bunch of those activities lined up along the table. And, maybe you'll tie shoes here. Maybe you'll push a bunch of buttons or solve a little wood sliding puzzle here. Maybe you'll roll balls around in a maze here. And that was very much what it was. And it was child centered in the fact that I, as a student, could go around and choose what I did. Is there a curriculum for it? I don't want to get too deep into the education history of Montessori, but Montessori is actually an untrademarked, non-copyrighted IP. Its founder, who was a woman named Montessori. Her first name has escaped me, but she didn't trademark it. So basically, any person can open up a school and call it a Montessori school. So is there a curriculum? There's an underlying philosophy. There are principles that guide it, but is there a hard-bound textbook that is the Montessori curriculum? No. So like a lot of other teaching philosophies, it's kind of dependent on how the pedagogue or the teacher uses it.
Yeah, we
So
do, not to get too much into this, but we do have like some schools that run under the Montessori model. Some are
mm,
freaking amazing and others
yes.
are not so great. I think critics, the biggest criticism I usually hear about Montessori schools, I know very little of them since I never attended one or taught in one, is that sometimes students could leave with gaps in knowledge just because
Yes.
because
Yeah.
they're a little too free to pursue what it is that they want, that, oh, wait a minute, I didn't get all the presidents down or something like that.
Yeah. And I think that that's a very reflective of the general tension between child-centered learning and teacher-centered learning. That recently, in recent years, everybody's been rah, 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 child-centered. Follow the kids' passions and interests so that they'll stay engaged. True. But what if Tommy is only engaged in, I don't know, wanting to play video games? And like, yes, you can design a whole curriculum about video games, but at some point, he's got to
Yeah.
do his multiplication times tables. At
Yes.
some point, he's got to be able to do a spelling test. So I think Montessori was really great for the child-centered aspect of it. But you're right, it is very easy for it to get so child-centered that they don't learn some very fundamental basic skills.
Yeah. You
But
seem to
again,
have
yeah.
turned out great. So
Well, thank you. Well, I was only there for 2 years. I could have stayed there for longer. Um, but I actually went to a private school for grades 3 to 8. I went to a private school that was actually flavored like Montessori, but it was based on the teachings of Friedrich Froebel. So Friedrich Froebel is the founder of the kindergarten. A lot of people don't realize this, but kindergarten is actually the German term for garden of children. And
Ah,
his idea was that you shouldn't treat a classroom of kids like they're on a factory line, and that they all fit into this certain mold. You have to treat them like a garden. Some are going to sprout very quickly, some are going to take a little bit longer to bloom, some are going to be very, very colorful here, and some are going to be more hardy and sturdy like a vegetable. So you have to treat your class like their garden, and you have to tend to each one individually depending on their needs.
that's beautiful, and it's always
Mm.
sounded like a German word, like Kindergarten.
Kindergarten.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that word, and I there's a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I
Yeah.
remember him saying that, and it does sound like a very German word, and but it's
That
kind
would
of a
be a
it's a very
fantastic movie.
it's a very beautiful it's a beautiful phrase though.
It is. I would love to see a movie of Arnold Schwarzenegger as Friedrich Froebel. That would be amazing.
But I think it's called Kindergarten Cop. He actually plays a
Oh
kindergarten
yeah, that's I think that's what's making it click for me, right? So yeah, I grew up in this private elementary school that was very much about play. It was very much about nature. That was kind of a big thing, that we were really outside a lot. And it was also very little homework. They actually were very much, now they weren't against homework, but they really didn't introduce the idea of bringing work home with you until maybe grade 6, grade
Wow.
5. Yeah, it was pretty late. And some other things were, yes, cross-age social interactions. They really made an effort to have different grades interact with different grades. So if you're in grade 8, you're going to have a reading buddy in grade 1. If you're in grade 2, you're going to do a partner science project with some grade 7s. And they also had school-wide activities where they mixed everybody up, kind of like houses, like the Harry Potter houses, where regardless of your year, you belong to a house or a
Mm.
group, as we call them. And that fostered activities where we would interact with each other.
And
So
that's kind of
yeah.
beautiful in a way because I like that we're taking older kids and having them kind of serve as a like a teacher almost, because
Mhm.
it teaches them responsibility, and they have to probably be a little bit more mindful with their behavior, the language that they use, just because there's somebody younger. And I think one of the best ways to co-opt anyone into any system is to give them some degree of authority, because
Yep.
once you give
Yep.
somebody a degree of authority, now they're brought into the system.
Yeah, and they can value it and perceive it in a different way than they
Yeah.
otherwise wouldn't have had to. So I guess before I go into how, amazing and great my elementary years were, I need to stress that this was a private school. And at that, this was a private alternative school.
Okay.
So this was not your typical private school in Canada or Ontario, and it definitely wasn't your typical public school. So unfortunately, I don't have much to draw on to talk about the elementary years. I really did like that style of schooling, and we can talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of having such a small community that's based like that. By the way, each class or each grade was about 8 to 10 kids. And so it
Wow.
was very, very small. Yeah. And it wasn't because, we're paying lots and lots of money. It's just the school building itself was very, very small. And, the number of staff was small too. So again, that comes with a whole lot of advantages. It comes with quite a few disadvantages too. So bearing that all in mind, then I went to two Catholic high schools when I was in my high school years. So for grade 9 and 10, I was in an IB program, International Baccalaureate program, or the pre-IB program. I should really correct myself. And then when I got to the end of grade 10, they said I had to pick an elective, and music was not one of the electives that I could choose. And so I thought, well, I'm playing violin, every day. I'm playing trumpet and saxophone in concert bands and jazz bands. Like I need music. Like I can't not do music. So I eventually switched and I went to a different public Catholic high school. So I can definitely talk about the public school experience from a high school perspective. And
And
interesting,
just to
a Catholic,
clarify,
yeah.
yeah, just to clarify for our listeners, when a lot of Americans hear the word Catholic school, they automatically assume it's a private school. And
Hmm.
in Canada, you can have Catholic schools that you don't pay for, and they are a part of the public system.
Yes, and that's actually more specific even to Ontario, to a certain province. I believe there's another province, but that does it too. But it's been mostly phased out. It's actually the United Nations actually declared the practice discriminatory because you're privileging one religion over others. And
Huh.
there's a whole history for why the Ontario school system still has Catholic and non-Catholic public systems. It's a whole rabbit hole that we can go down if we want. But I think maybe for our purposes, that's
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
my snapshot, right? That I was in private schools. Well, I did Montessori for 2 years briefly, and then I was in a private elementary school, and then I went to two different public Catholic schools when I was older. And then after that, I did my an undergraduate in music education, and then I went to Shanghai for 2 years, and then came back to Toronto, got my teacher certification, and then now I'm teaching as a music teacher.
Yeah, let's zoom into your high school years because you were in a public school.
So to talk about that, and I hate to even split hairs even further, but because I was in the pre-IB program in grade 9 and 10, that itself was an advanced or an enhanced or an exclusive program that, yes, it was available to the public, but in order to get into that, you had to write a standardized test to get in. So that was kind of, cream of the academic crop in my first 2 years. And the next year I went to a more general program that had a really nice music program, but it wasn't a specialized school in grade 11 and 12. And so if I'm going to talk about grade 9 and 10, I'm definitely going to be talking about how there was this definite divide between the IB kids and the non-IB kids. Now, and so it's interesting to hear that, yes, this is all within the public system, but even still, that feudalism you're talking about exists there too. That if you can manage to get your child into this program, they'll be more likely to get into their first choice university, which means they'll be more likely to get that high value job that they're going after. The IB program was really geared towards medicine students and engineering students. Law school, they said, but really the only choices I was allowed to pick were math, science, English, and then maybe one other one, economics or another history or something. There really wasn't a big choice, bearing in mind we had to do religion.
One question I want to ask, you said there was an exam to get accepted into this program. Is that something your parents helped you with? Was that just a book you could get from the library and study for, or did you have to take classes to prepare for that?
Well, that's really interesting because it's similar to how you would prepare for the standardized test to get into university in the States, right? So the intention of this SSAT, I believe it's the secondary school assessment test, you're actually not supposed to study for it. You're just supposed to walk in and do it. And if you do well, yes, you're ready for an advanced program. But that's definitely not in practice how it turns out, that we have students who are being drilled and they practice and they study so hard when they're in the 8th grade so that they can perform well on this high pressure test that's supposed to be a measure of natural ability. And that's what gets you into this high value program, which will supposedly get you into a high value secondary program, which will get you into a high value job. So, I think maybe I'm discoloring the rosy picture that maybe Canada has in its public education system, because that definitely exists both for IB and for the advanced placement situation. But in grade 11 and 12, when I was in this more regular quote unquote program, I don't really even know where to start with it. I had a really positive experience. I did notice things that were different from my experience of being with very advanced students to being with average students. And I have lots of little stories here and there.
So, Daniel, I think it's really interesting that towards the end of your high school career, you were with these really advanced high track students, but then there were also regular students. And even when that was the case, there was some way that the regular track student was not being disruptive, or there was some way that both of these students could kind of coexist in the same classroom and still get what they needed. And I'm wondering, did the teacher in the classroom ever assign the really high functioning kid to work with the regular track kid and maybe tutor it, sort of the brother that can feed the other brother does so sort of mentality? Or did the high track kids just create their own little enclave in the back, in the front of the classroom or something?
Yeah. I think this would be a really good point to maybe draw some administrative logistical comparisons between your high school classes and the Ontario high school classes, because in Ontario, from what I remember, is that there were streams. It was a streamed secondary school program. So there was academic, that was kind of the top level one. The academic classes are your biology, your calculus, your academic English. This is for students going to university. So this is the highest kind of category. Then there was college. So college C classes, college English, or family life, or college level history classes. They were all, I really don't want to say dumbed down, but they were simplified and they were streamlined. And the expectations were not as high. The academic rigor wasn't there for these college programs because it's meant for students who are going into trades, who are going maybe using their hands. Like the carpentry class, for example, was college, or the botany class was college. And
Hmm.
then you have mixed classes, M classes, and these mixed classes were eligible for university, but also college students could come in and take them. So in these mixed classes, I took a psychology class, so psychology, anthropology, and sociology. That class was mixed. So you have some students who are geared towards university being there and some who are not.
Now I have a question.
Yeah.
The kids that are on the college track, and it's weird for me to say that because college and
Yes.
university in the States are one and the same, but
Mhm.
let's just use the word vocational track, right? So for the
Yes.
kids that
Yeah.
are on the vocational track, if they were on that track, was there any hope of them ever going to university, or was it like that's it, your cards have been dealt and you'll never step foot in a university? How does
Yes.
that work?
So that's one of the big issues that the public school system is facing in Ontario. That basically in grade 9, if you don't do well on your English and your math, your teachers or your guidance counselor will heavily recommend that you don't go into the university stream. That you should take this vocational stream. That, okay, well, you really didn't do well on your standardized math test, you really didn't do well on your standardized English test, university probably isn't for you, so you should probably head towards the trades or the vocations or something else.
Hmm.
And so that those cards get dealt to you in pretty much grade 9 and grade 10. It's very, very difficult for someone who did college level English to transition into university 12 English and then apply to university. That's very difficult to do, and it often doesn't happen. Same thing with math. So that's something that, it's got a dark spot. There's definitely problems with it, but at the same time, you're avoiding this other problem where you have a class of all different ability levels, and the really, really high advanced kids feel like they're being dragged down,
Yes.
or the really low performing or low achieving students feel like they're being rushed forward.
Yes.
And so there's no perfect solution to this, but that's at least how it's being handled right now in Ontario.
And the teacher just has to teach to the middle, basically. I mean, and
Yeah.
and hope,
Yeah.
hope that the upper kids look down a little bit, and the kids that are struggling somehow climb the mountain just ever
Yeah.
so much higher. One final question on this issue: if you have the like if you are on the vocational track and you get a vocational high school diploma, will a university even look at that, or do you have to then go back and take more high school
Mhm.
classes? Like, can you even get your foot in the door, or is that it?
So the diploma is the same
Okay.
regardless. Like we all walk out with a high school diploma, but it's the credits that really matter.
Hmm.
In order to apply to a science program at, say, Western University, you need to have X number of science credits, X number of English credits. And if those credits are not U level, if they're not university level, it'll either not let you apply at all, or you're going to be very disadvantaged in the selection process.
So there's no second chances.
In a term, if you take a victory lap, which, is basically a grade 13, you can, do all of your university level credits that way. That's possible too. And that does happen. But at the same time, if you've been struggling up until grade 12 to perform at a university level, chances are you're going to struggle in that 13th year too. So it's kind of tough. It's hard to say which is really, the lesser of the two evils when it comes to that.
Okay, no, I'm going to touch upon that when I tell my story, but yeah, go
Mhm.
ahead, continue.
Yeah, because I'm curious to, maybe we can do it later. I
Yeah,
wanna
yeah, yeah,
I
for
wanna
sure.
see what how the New York,
Answer is
yeah.
The New York answer to this.
Yeah. So yeah, I did that, and then I finished my university undergraduate, and then I basically followed a path to be a teacher, and so now I'm a teacher, and I have lots of nuanced, complex opinions on all of these little things, but I don't want to necessarily take the conversation in the wrong direction. But that's essentially my story. It was Montessori for a year or two, and then private elementary up until grade 8, and then an advanced public program in 9-10, and then a regular program in 11-12, university undergrad, and then now teacher.
Could you maybe describe a little bit of the educational setting that you're working in right now?
Yes. So I was trying very, very hard to get into the public system. I really wanted to be a public school music teacher. But with COVID-19 happening, all of the public systems are, well, at least back when I was applying for my jobs, they were really, really lagging. So they're typically slow already. And that's to be expected of a government institution, or
Yes.
at least, an offshoot of a government institution. The public option is slower because there's just more people in it and there's more to do, and it's affected a lot more heavily by a pandemic, for example. So while I was applying and doing interviews for the public systems, I was also doing interviews and applications for the private system too. Because I grew up in the private system, I didn't necessarily look down on it. I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't think it was the evil that's going to destroy the education system in Canada. I was open to it. So I did both. I weighed both my options. And when it came around to who got back to me, I found this really, really awesome opportunity to teach music at a private school, and I took it, and I really love it. It's very, very small. It's actually very similar to the school that I grew up in, and yeah, I'm really enjoying it. And I do recognize and I do appreciate the privilege that I work with, that it's a small school with supportive parents who are financially stable, and that makes a huge difference because I
Mm.
did placements, I did student teaching placements at all types of schools around the city. So I've seen the different kind of statuses that different public schools have. So would I want to eventually go back into the public system? Yes, I would. But I've got a really, really good thing going for me right now. What I tell myself to help me feel better is that I still volunteer with a music school that teaches only underprivileged students who otherwise wouldn't have access to music education. I do that. I volunteer for them. So that's kind of what I do to quell my own what's the word? It's not like selfishness or greediness. It's just,
Survivor's guilt.
yeah, maybe that's what it is, survivor's guilt. Because in teachers college in Ontario, it's understood that you're going to be a public school teacher, and there's almost this evil associated with the private school system that, if you're going to be a teacher, you just care about money. You don't care about kids or teaching or education. You just want that paycheck and you want to be teaching rich kids, right? And maybe I interpreted that, but I definitely felt that when I was in teachers college.
That's funny. That's funny. Actually,
Mm.
private school teachers in the States make less than the public school
And you
teachers,
know
right?
what? That is also true in Ontario as well.
Huh.
That's also true in Ontario. So there's almost this like misunderstanding about private school teachers. But I actually have a whole explanation for that too. But maybe we'll get into that later.
Okay. Uh, down, up for my story.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I grew up in Queens, New York, and I have to say that for the most part, my elementary school education was pretty rock solid. I went
Mm,
no, my entire life I attended nothing but public schools, all from K to 12. And the thing that really stuck with me about my elementary school education is that we really had rock solid teachers. And we had a pretty ironclad, no nonsense principle, and it's very interesting that you kind of have this like praise for Montessori. In many ways, my elementary school was like the opposite of
mhm.
Montessori in the sense that it was very regimented, very disciplined. And as a kid, we all hate discipline, right? We all
Yeah.
hate the scary principal. And it's like, oh, you're going to the principal's office. But in a way, it kind of actually kept us in line. And when I tell my middle school and high school experiences, it'll make a lot more sense. So I went to a very, very, very traditional and like maybe middle class elementary school. This was the kind of school where the teachers had been working there. Like each teacher had spent, you could really enter this school and basically retire. Like the teachers would
Mhm.
not
Yeah.
leave. Like they loved their job so much that they would spend like 20 years there. And it was very orderly. Like kids did not shout out, kids raised their hand. We would line up to go to lunch, and there was very little cursing, very little fights. And it's really amazing when you think about a New York City public school
Mhm.
that this was such the case. And there was actually what you just described. There was a program called Talented and Gifted, and that was
Mhm.
sort of an advanced track program for kids that really pushed themselves or had parents that pushed them. Back then, I was a knucklehead, so I was not a part of any of that stuff. I was like the gen ed kid, as you would call it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had moments, I had subjects that I really shined in and really sparkled in, and there were things that I just kind of slacked off on.
Mm.
But I would say that looking back, elementary school is really the most important school that you will ever attend. Because if it wasn't, and I look at other people who have had very different outcomes to that of myself, and it's like elementary school taught me how to read. They really did. The elementary
Yeah.
school I went to really stressed books. At the end of the year, we had a chart, and every time you would read a book, you would put a sticker on this chart. And if you read 25 books by the end of the year, you would actually get a pizza party.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and this was really, and I don't know how often that happens. We were also stressed to learn the multiplication tables, and in a lot of schools today, they're just doing away with that. And
Mhm.
some people will be like, oh, that's just rigid thinking or whatever. But when you get to factoring and you get to higher forms of math, being able to know that 12 times 12 is 144 really helps, when you're
Mhm.
looking at perfect squares and stuff. So I really did enjoy my elementary school years for the most part. There were some problems, but for the most part, I'm very proud of it. Things took a pretty downward spiral once I hit middle school. And when I hit middle school, we had students coming from all over Queens, and it really just became an absolute shit show at this point.
Yeah.
The teachers that worked at this school, and again, I unfortunately was a knucklehead, so I ended up in my zoned middle school. I didn't apply to any special middle schools or anything like that. Funny you should mention that you took a special test. In New York City, there are specialized middle schools and high schools that you can go to. We have high schools known as Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Townsend Harris. And if you take an exam, you can get into one of these high schools and you can have a completely different experience. You have a
Are
completely, yeah, go ahead,
are
man.
are, the, are those standardized exams, or is it particular to the school?
They are standardized. It's a standardized test. Again, I
Mhm.
knucklehead here. Didn't take any of those
Yeah,
exams.
yeah.
My mind was totally in the wrong place. But yes, there is a standardized test, and pretty much the higher you score on it, the more the more likely you are to be invited to attend one of those schools. And some people think of it as a backdoor IQ test, but there is a lot of test prep culture that goes on in New York
Yeah.
City, and if you've got fairly either affluent parents or parents that are in the know, in the know and know, they will push their kids to study for these exams so their kids you pretty much, if you attend one of these specialized high schools in New York, you pretty much get a premier, like Ivy League almost education. You're almost guaranteed, if you get into one of these high schools, you're pretty much guaranteed to almost get into like a top 10 school.
Mhm.
So again, there is that option for like the few and far between, but not for most. So back to me, knucklehead in a zoned middle school. It was absolutely chaotic, Daniel, and there were fights every day, kids just cutting class, disrespectful behavior. The desks were filled with graffiti. Teachers did not last in this middle school for very
Mhm.
long. They would maybe do their 2 or 3 years. It was like pretty much like military service. They did their 3 or 4 years, got their discharge papers, and
Yeah.
went back to civilian life.
Mhm.
And growing up in this, obviously when I was in elementary school, I took for granted the discipline. I took for granted the middle class culture that was in that school that stressed discipline, rigor, reading books, and all that good stuff. So when I got here, at first I appreciated the freedom, but then when you've been in your fifth fight, you start to
Mhm.
be like, oh my God, where are the adults? Where is the structure? Where are the
Yeah.
rules? And I really kind of suffered the most. And there's a lot of gaps in my own education. Like, for example, after lunch on most days, I would just leave school. Like, I would have lunch like sixth period, and then I'd be like, well, math is a complete shit show. I'm just going to leave. And I would actually just tell the teacher, like, this class is a joke. I'm leaving. I would just
Mhm.
leave middle, like just leave school and go home and do something or whatever. And a part of it is me just being a knucklehead, but a part of it I also believe is no accountability and really no standards, and no adults in my life to kind of push me in the right direction.
Yeah. Do you think that was because they're just was it a funding issue? Was it a leadership issue? Or do I guess you were a kid, right? So maybe you couldn't even tell, but
Oh, I mean, I could definitely answer that. I mean,
Mhm.
like, here's the thing. So in New York City, public school classrooms are up to like 34 kids, right? And we could say it's a funding issue. When 34 kids in a classroom, that's a lot, which it
It is
is,
a
by the
lot.
way. I would
It
love to
is.
I would love to see that number get down to like 20 or something. But here's the deal. The resources that were in the elementary school were about the same as the ones in the middle school, right? And in my elementary school, which I had a fairly decent experience, there was also 34 kids in a classroom.
True.
The
True.
difference comes down to I think a more permissive nature from leadership of like very low expectations. I think what it
Mhm.
came down to is I wouldn't say it was the teachers that necessarily had low expectations, but the people above those teachers had very low expectations. They saw us as I hate to say it, but I think that in some ways they saw us as working class dirt. And
Mhm.
like when I went to my elementary school, even though some of us were working class, some of us were middle class, some of us were upper middle class, the teachers and the system just had an extremely high bar. Like it doesn't matter that you're brand new to this country. It doesn't matter if your
Mhm.
parents are working class. We are going to teach you to read, and we are going to make you perform at an extremely high level. And when I got to middle school, there was just an expectation that, oh, these kids are all working class dirt. We'll just, let's just keep passing them along, and then hopefully, they'll get a job in the civil service, collecting
Mhm.
trash or doing whatever.
Yeah, because there, if I can jump in here, that when I was in teachers college, one of the more surprising points of information that I learned from my special needs instructor and from my ESL instructor were both high expectations. You need to have high expectations for students who are learning English and who need extra support because yes, they're disadvantaged, true, but you need to make sure that you are expecting them to reach high milestones because if you don't do that, it will compound in the reverse order. They will collapse on themselves and feel that it's not worth it or they can't do it. And it's counterintuitive because you think, well, I'm going to give this kid a break because he needs it. No, you should actually do the opposite. You need to be pushing them from the ground up and supporting them. And unfortunately, parents who maybe aren't as informed as us educated teachers, they will do that for them. They'll cut them slack whenever they can, and that actually harms them more than it helps them.
Yes,
Yeah.
really, really well said, Daniel. I couldn't say it better myself, actually. And I think that's how those teachers and maybe some administrators viewed me. They saw
Mhm.
me, oh, this is a working class kid. It's okay if he's cutting my class. I'm still going to pass him. And as a kid, you're elated. You're like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, I don't have to go to math class and I'm still going to pass because you're
Yeah.
thinking from the mind of a child. And a
Yeah.
child just wants to get away with as much as humanly possible. So they thought they were being generous and benevolent to me, but in actuality, they were kind of screwing me over because there's a
Mhm.
lot of gaps that I have in my knowledge that I'm done blaming people, but at the
Mhm.
same time, like they were hurdles that I had to overcome. I get to high school again. Still, I go to a very overcrowded high school. Over 5,000 kids in my high school. It's so overcrowded that the juniors and seniors start school at 7 a.m. in the morning and get out of school at 11:30 in the morning, which is actually pretty awesome if you've got
Oh.
a part-time job. I,
Yeah.
I kind of liked it. But the freshmen and sophomores started school at 11:30, like in the morning, and then would go to school until like 5:30 at night because the school was so overcrowded they couldn't have the freshmen and the seniors in the same building at the same time. The
Yeah.
building would just explode if that ever happened. So that I think is a funding resource issue. So
Yeah.
if I wanted to put my finger at like lack of funding, something like that should be fixed via funding and building more schools. My high school is better than that of my middle school in the sense that there are something called honors classes.
Yeah.
Again, total knucklehead here. I find myself in a few honors classes in English and history. Those are just areas that I naturally excel at. And I actually get a pretty darn decent education when I find myself in an honors class.
So is that analogous to the academic classes that I'm talking about, or not quite?
Okay, I'll get to that in a
Yeah.
sec.
Okay.
I'll explain
Mhm.
how the high school diploma works in New York City.
Mhm.
But you have regular classes and you have honors classes, and then you have AP classes where you can actually
Right.
earn college credit while in high school. So when I find myself in an honors class, typically in history or English, I get a premium education. I'm learning Shakespeare. I'm with kids that are well behaved and do their homework, and we don't curse out a teacher, and we respect teachers, and we respect schoolwork in general. And I learned quite a bit. And that's something that did not exist in my middle school at all. However, in areas that I kind of struggle with, like math, and maybe I skipped a few too many math classes back in middle school,
Yeah.
it's again a complete shit show where kids are cursing, yelling, and fighting one another, and the teacher is just crying at his or her desk. And we didn't have like Monster and Indeed. They got the classified open, and they're looking for a new job, and rightfully so. It's a
Yeah.
complete
Yeah.
shit show. No one
Yeah.
wants to be there, students and teacher alike. And it's a really mixed bag, but what kind of happens is that my good elementary school training kicks in, and I'm like, okay, there is a difference. I do know better. I do know how to read, right? Like the
Mm,
fact that someone taught me to read before I entered, because there were kids that had nothing but a shit show from kindergarten up. I was at least fortunate enough to be in a good place in elementary school and that I knew how to read a book. So I realized that I stopped being a knucklehead, I think, towards 11th grade. I
mm,
start wising up. I change as a human being. I start exercising. I start lifting weights and doing push-ups, and that gets a lot of my teenage angst out of my system.
mhm.
And I begin taking school a lot more seriously. And at the last second, I was able to save myself and get decent enough grades to end up at a decent enough college. Now, to answer
Mhm.
your earlier point about how that works, one of the one of the positive things and one of the maybe negative things about New York City is that we have a belief that everybody is going to college. And this is both idealistic dream, but it's also a freaking nightmare because what ends up
Agreed.
happening is that you've got kids that really are just not academically inclined. And I don't want to get into this right now as to why that is, but they are being forced to apply for universities. They're being
Yeah.
forced to study Shakespeare, to study things that are way beyond their grasp.
Same thing
And
happens here a lot. Yeah.
yeah, and they would just be better off, and there's nothing wrong with this. They would be better off learning how to be a plumber and earning a great salary. There's nothing
Mhm.
wrong with that. But in New York City, we used to, but we no longer have any vocational training whatsoever. We expect everyone is going to become a college professor. And what ends up happening is a lot of people just get left behind and end up with nothing. So
Yeah.
I actually give credit to the Canadian system, and as much people are giving that flack for, like, man, you're preventing people from entering university. No, in a way, you're taking care of your citizens who aren't going to be able to compete or think at that level and setting them up for success in the vocational sphere.
Yeah, that's definitely the intention of it. And I think to a degree, it does work. It's just that, there's, of course, a dark underbelly to it too, where, someone has a crappy math teacher in grade 8, they don't do well in grade 9, university is no longer accessible to them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have far less, students do what you're saying, where they push and push and push and push themselves to become a doctor, but they have to work so much harder than their classmates that they're just not going to make it, and
Yeah.
then, and it's not that they end up with nothing, they end up with a bunch of student debt and no job. That's kind of what's even worse, right? Luckily, in Canada, generally speaking, and definitely in Ontario, college and university is secondary education is just much more affordable than it is, I think, in most of the states. So, it's not as bad, I guess, but it's still not the most ideal.
One positive, this is something that's a pure positive. I'll give New York City credit. If you graduate on the margins from high school, let's just say you barely passed all of your classes, we do have a very strong community college system.
Hmm.
And if you do your 2 years at community college, you can then get entrance into a university. So one thing
Yeah,
that is positive about New York City is we do believe in second chances. So
yeah.
even if you're a crappy high school student and you get an what we call a 2 year degree or an associate's degree at a community college, 4 year universities will take you and you can pick yourself up and fix your life. So that is
Hmm.
a positive. I don't know if Canada has a 2 year system like that.
Yeah, like we had, like when I say college, I typically refer to either kind of like public option universities or trade schools, vocational schools. So
Yeah.
that is definitely possible on our side up here. But I kind of want to go back to how disparaging the differences between somebody who goes from kindergarten to grade 12 not being able to read at a grade 3 level. Like to me, I would be extremely surprised if I met anybody in Canada that was like that. Granted, of course, I had a very privileged upbringing, but that seems way, way, way too unacceptable by Canadian standards and Ontario standards. Like, yes, there are lots of students who struggle with reading for sure, but to think that it's that extreme in New York City is like, whoa. Because I've worked in a very rough, very, very rough Toronto school in the downtown core, so I know I have a flavor for what that's like. And the worst case kid can still read at a grade 6 level or grade 8 level at least. And I would be appalled if someone graduated from high school not being able to read like that.
I'm glad that you touched upon that. And I think what it comes down to is what you originally said, Daniel, is that in New York City, there's a lot of people that, first off, a lot of the teachers in New York City did not actually grow up in New York City. And this is a huge distinction that we're
Yeah.
making here. I'm actually the exception. I'm one of the rare people that actually grew up in New York City and actually taught in New York City. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of teachers that grow up in fairly affluent suburbs.
Yes.
So they grew up in wonderful suburbs. There is also a racial element to this as well. Most of them are white. And what ends up happening is they end up teaching in working class schools, and they kind of have this guilt, or they have this idea of like, oh my goodness, these kids, they didn't have the same opportunities as me. They, their parents are at home doing all sorts of crazy things. I gotta just give these kids a break in life. That's what they really
Yeah.
need. That's what
Yeah.
they really
Yeah.
need, Daniel, is a break in life. I gotta be so, oh, you didn't do your homework. Oh, you got a 10 on your math test. It's okay. I'm gonna pass you. So you have a lot of administrators, you have even some teachers to some degree. The best teachers, by the way, are teachers like me that grew up in New York City, and we know the
Yeah.
dealio. We
Yeah.
know the
Yeah.
dealio, and we know what it takes to survive. And
Sounds like a true New York statement.
yeah. We know the dealio, and we know what it takes to really pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I know that that's the most controversial term, but I'm actually using it. And they think, they kind of have a bleeding heart, and they think that they're actually helping by having low standards. Like sometimes, like when a kid is cursing at them, or doing all this, oh, he doesn't know better.
Yeah.
And that's like a backhanded way of saying we're they kind of, it's almost, they're not saying this, but there's almost a very latent assumption that we're less intelligent. Like there's this
Yeah.
latent assumption that we are more primitive, we are less intelligent, or we don't need to be held to a very high standard. Like we were
Yeah.
raised by wolves, like
And
angry.
and that's where you belong, right?
Yes,
That's yeah.
yes. There's this idea that we were raised by wolves, and there's no way that we can ever pull ourselves out of this situation. So it's under the Trojan horse of kindness and
Yeah.
generosity and benevolence. But what it really is it's kind of a sort of class prejudice in a way for working class kids. Obviously you can see me, I look white to you. So if you are in one of these schools, you are, because you're in, by virtue of being in the inner city or being in an urban school, you are just treated differently. You were treated as less capable. And I think that that is probably the most dangerous things. Like, did our school have the most updated textbooks? Did they have like the most advanced technology? Like there are schools out there, Daniel, in the suburbs that have swimming pools. Okay.
Yeah.
Like that's freaking, let me just tell you, that is freaking awesome to have a school that has a swimming pool. The only swimming pool that we had was probably like a leaking ceiling that
Yeah.
went to a bucket.
Yeah. Or you have a puddle for a splash pad or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah, like a puddle. But it really wasn't any of those things. I think what
Hmm.
it is this low expectation. And I think the one thing that Canada has right that we can learn from is that you have discipline, and you have really high expectations for working class kids. And if you do that, you can you're not going to be able to help everybody, and some people might get left behind, but you can really squeeze some greatness out of everybody.
Yeah, I think it comes down to not necessarily high expectations, but there's a very high value for education in most of Canada. That especially immigrant parents, of which Ontario is made up, predominantly of now, immigrant parents really, really, really value education. It doesn't matter how poor you are, it doesn't matter which country you come from, what your skin color is, what your religion is, education matters and it's important. And that's what will push you out of whatever social class you're in. And I think there's a general understanding, at least throughout Ontario. I'm very hesitant to say it about all of Canada because there are farmers in central Canada who hate school and just want to work on the farm. There are high school students on the East Coast who just want to fish with their dad and they don't care about education. I'm I got to be careful here. I don't want to have all of Canada hate me right now with these disgusting stereotypes that I'm saying. So I want to keep it localized to Ontario. But at least with my experience, both as a teacher and as a student, and just interacting with people, I think there's a lot of value placed on education, and that's reflected in our government, and it's reflected in our politicians and our elected officials. That we do have per capita one of the highest educated populations in the world. We have more people with bachelor's degrees per capita than almost any other country.
Wow,
And
wow.
that's great. That's really good for a lot of reasons. There's, again, I always bring about the dark underbelly of that there's not enough jobs for all those bachelor's degrees. But at the same time, I think it's better to have an overeducated society rather than an undereducated society. And I think that's what we've got here. And that's part of the reason why so much money goes to schooling, even just money towards teacher salaries. Like, I think the teacher salary divide is huge in the United States. Like, teachers working at poverty line level wages in certain parts of America. And that's just unimaginable in Canada. Like, the teachers, they have to be doing better than poverty levels, and
Yes.
so that's due to a lot of political and cultural and historical reasons, I'm sure, but I think that's the big one. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, I mean, there is this nasty stereotype about teachers that they're all like the B plus students of their university. Like
Yes. Yeah.
if you're really smart, you're going to work in tech or in
Hmm.
banking or something like that. So there is that, and maybe like in New York, like I will say this, like in New York, the salary is not as high as I would have liked it to be, but it wasn't poverty wages. Like
Yeah.
it was never the salary that made me hate teaching. It's probably all the
Mm.
other reasons that I just mentioned
Yeah.
that kind of left a sour taste in my mind. But going back to your earlier point, it's funny because the United States sees itself, like we advertise internally and probably externally, as being a true meritocracy. We were like,
Yeah.
oh, you come to
Yeah.
America and you work hard, you get educated, and you will make it. But and that's that's maybe our propaganda or advertising, but it's not really like that here because we do have like this invisible caste system in some way where it's like, oh well, if you're from a working class background, we're going to have very soft low expectations for what it is that you can achieve. Like I think that if some of my former teachers found out that I was like first off, they probably don't even remember me, but like it's I've had friends, Daniel,
Mm.
that graduated from the same high school as me, and they actually went on to decent universities and then ended up in really good careers like banking, and they were actually told by their employer, like, what, you went to that high school, how did you get here? They
Mm.
like
Yeah.
the employer is actually shocked that somebody could grow up in this area of Queens or go to this public school and actually go to like a decent university and actually work their way up to banking. Like the employer is
Mm.
actually shocked,
Yeah.
and it kind of shows you how far away from being a meritocracy the United States really is. Whereas I would argue from what you're telling me, and again, I know that you're speaking about a very specific
Hmm.
province, that Canada believes that everyone should at least read at a sixth or seventh grade reading level, and that
Hmm.
there is this idea that with enough elbow grease and with enough work, everyone can go to university if they want to, if they choose to.
Yeah, like I think a big part of that is the national and provincial funding for post-secondary education. That it's first of all, tuition levels are a fraction of what they are in the States. That's the first thing. But then the government will also give you an interest-free loan, basically, for the entirety of your studying career. And then once you graduated, you have 6 months to start, to begin your repayment plan. So it's just extremely accessible. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people who would disagree with me saying it should be even more accessible. But if you really lay out a solid financial plan, you go, I'm going to take out this much from, the province, take out this much from the federal funding and grants and loans. And then, I spend this amount of years working, I should be able to pay off my loan after obtaining a university degree. Like, it takes work, but it's there for you. So I think that's probably the biggest difference, because what I'm gathering from you is that that's not what happens.
I mean, universities here are pretty prohibitive in terms of how expensive they are. If
Hmm.
you go to a private school, again, even for my university, I went to a public college, and we could argue that that's less prestigious, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, I was pretty poor, so I just had to go
Hmm.
with wherever would take me and so forth. And I like to also just learn on my own. So I
Hmm.
think that kind of helps. Like if you're just curious and if you have a good library card, the things you can learn, Daniel.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah.
uh, so I think that in the States, college is very expensive if you go to a private. If you go to a public and you get a scholarship, or there are some public schools that if you're really below the poverty line, you can go to school for free or with a lot of enhanced financial aid. So we're starting to figure that out. But what I think, it even beyond the university system, like I believe no matter how perfect the education system is, not everyone is going to turn out to be a university graduate.
Yes. Yeah.
But what I like about the Canadian model is that if you go down the vocational track, there's still sort of an egalitarian nature of Canada that says, even if you're a farmer, even if you're fixing cars, we're going to make sure that you can read the newspaper at a seventh grade reading level and have a basic understanding of politics, a basic understanding of laws, a basic understanding of science, and so forth.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, beyond the university question, I think the most important thing is having an education that at the very least is egalitarian, where the working class person can talk to the university educated person and they can actually hold
Hmm.
down a conversation together.
Yeah, because up until grade 8, functionally speaking, everyone's public education is the same.
Yeah.
Maybe in grade 7, 8, there's a gifted thing, maybe, but I think I'm comfortable saying this across Canada that grade 1 to grade 8, everybody pretty much gets the same opportunities, generally speaking. I'm so cautious about saying this because I just came out of teachers college where we focus so much on the inequities of the public school system, and there are a lot, but I think we have to make sure that we're taking things into perspective here and really zooming out and looking at the rest of the world. Like Ontario has, in my estimation and the estimation of a number of my instructors, one of the best public school systems in the world for a number of reasons. We still, and yes, we are very critical of it, but I think that's part of the reason why it is so good, is because we're constantly looking at, well, what's not quite even or fair or equal about this. And so I guess that doesn't happen in the States nearly as much, in terms of being, well, I'm sure lots of people are critical of the American system, but like I'm trying to figure out what it is, just talking with you and realizing, wow, I am really lucky. Like the things that you're saying are like, this is appalling. Like I can't believe that this is something that's just, common knowledge. So
I think in the States, one of the biggest fallacies is that it's just a money, money, money issue. Like if we
mhm.
just if we just dump a dump truck of money into the schools, it will get better. And like, don't get me wrong,
It
man.
would help, but it
Yeah,
wouldn't.
I would love to see kids each having their own laptops and
Mhm.
swimming pools, like swimming pools across the public schools if need be. I'm all for that, and I think there is a monetary obligation there, but I think the expectation thing is really what it comes down
I think it's a
to.
cultural
Yeah,
values thing,
it's a cultural values thing, in the sense, because you have on the flip side of things, you have people that, let's say, grew up in communist countries or former communist countries, and they have almost no resources at all. They
Mhm.
they got like they grew up with like basic chalkboards. They had textbooks written in the 60s and whatnot, and they still had, though, like if you speak to people from the Eastern Bloc, they still had a high value of education. Their
Mhm. Yeah.
teachers were revered, they were
Yeah.
respected. You would stand up and bow to the teacher, or you would say good morning, sir.
Mhm.
And there was still like a high like no matter what your social class was, in these Eastern European countries, with all their lack of resources, they still believe that every citizen needed to be educated and needed to learn at a very, very high level. Even my own my girlfriend's from China, and the level of math that they do in middle school is equivalent to some of our college classes for some, and
Yeah.
like, is it that they had so much money? Did they have dump trucks of money coming in? No, it's a high expectation of human life.
Yeah, I have this thought occurring to me right now that I've never thought of before. I wonder, in all of these countries that we're referring to where education is still valued very highly, many East Asian countries, many Eastern European countries, in order to move up the social ladder, you needed to be educated. That was a requirement. Like you had to do well in school in order to make a lot of money in these countries that were less developed. But in the States, that story doesn't necessarily work anymore. You don't have to have a university doctorate to be famous and make a lot of money. Maybe that's ingrained in part of the American psyche that, you know what, I can be a millionaire. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Bill Gates dropped out of college.
Yeah, but
I don't need it.
that's a misleading story though, because I've looked at the data on this,
Mm-hmm.
and in America we tend to celebrate college dropouts and outliers and celebrities and people who made a fortune through unconventional means.
Yeah.
But if you actually get down to the nitty gritty of the data, if you have a university degree, especially a STEM university
Mm-hmm.
degree in one of the hard sciences, you are going to make so much more money than just a high school graduate. So
Yeah.
I would say that we in the United States are celebrating outliers, and
Yeah.
we're saying that those outliers are the norm, and those pathways are completely okay.
And
and
legitimate. Yeah.
and you know, people will always omit the fact that it's like Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard,
Yeah.
Mark
Yeah.
Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard. Like these guys had
Yeah.
flawless SAT score. Like they
Mm-hmm.
each got like flawless SAT scores and so forth. We're dealing with super level geniuses, and these
Mm-hmm.
people are true blue outliers. And I think the story is that yes, you do have some YouTube celebrity, but if you walk into an affluent area, Daniel, in America, I guarantee you everyone in that affluent area, most of them at least, have bachelor's, master's, and PhDs and law
Mm-hmm.
professional degrees. Surgeons, a lot of surgeons over here. Like that's really the name of the game. So I think
Mm-hmm.
we're basically deluding ourselves.
Yeah, that's what I think, that the that image has seduced so many people, and that maybe that's part of the reason why the education system isn't as valued as much.
Yeah.
Or, we could go deep state conspiracy theory
You know
here
what? I have an
if we want,
idea.
but we can maybe save it because
No,
that's a whole other
Daniel,
rabbit hole.
I think we need to have another. Let's table that for another podcast, my friend. I think
Sure.
that's a great idea. Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your story with us
Oh,
today.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I look forward to the next one.
This concludes the 55th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.